Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Ferry. Welcome to another rebroadcast from the RTB archives.
From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where we assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. Today, as usual, your hosts are me, John Plotz, and to my right, Victor Turner Prize-winning author, Elizabeth Ferry, golden anthropologist. Hello, Elizabeth. We're joined today on my left by Albion Lawrence, string theorist, quantum theorist, and also science fiction aficionado. So welcome, Albion. How dare I have you? Hey. So our topic today is one that I have brooded on for years, and I want to start with a full disclosure that for half a century, my dad was a bench scientist and my mom was an English professor. So it's not surprising that I would brood on this topic. And in fact, Albion, Elizabeth, and I have been chewing on it for months now. Basically, at its root, the question is, why do scientists seem to do collaboration and teamwork better than other kinds of scholars and academics? Now, I know there are 1,000 ways to dissect that question. After all, some humanists do work in collaborative teams, especially in Scandinavia, and many scientists, especially mathematicians and physicists, like, say, string theorists, do their best work alone. I don't know, Albion, would you say no? Oh my God, Albion is violently shaking his head. Okay, so to be discussed. Okay. So maybe
wasn't sure what I was supposed to do again, but yes, I'm not. No. It was a silent screen. Yes.
So, but in the main, scientists, especially lab scientists, seem to have some special sauce going on when it comes to thinking deep thoughts in a semi-detached way and then bringing them back into contact with others who will challenge them, push them, and bring those thoughts somewhere unexpected. So the basis of our conversation is something like, are feeble humanists and potentially feeble social scientists, I don't know, simply missing the boat? Or is there something else, something about the thinking that we do, a kind of disciplinary specificity that makes more doses of solitude or maybe even secrecy a necessity in some places in the academy and not in others? And where do social scientists fit in this triangulation or
Perennial problem.
Is it a perennial problem? And also, more cynically, and I think we're going to have a lot to say about this, is there reason to be suspicious of various discourses of team building or group collaboration that are making their way now out of Silicon Valley and out of corporate America into our universities? And, you know, the answer, of course, is no. There's nothing to fear. No problem. There's nothing to see here. So that's our discussion today, and we're going to dive right in with Albion introducing the text that we have chosen to give us a nice, chewy example of when scientific collaboration works well. So, Albion, what book did you suggest, and why is it a good place to start?
So the book I suggested was Richard Rhodes' book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb. This is it's a big book. It's essentially a combination of several things. First and foremost, it's a history of early 20th century science, physics, quantum mechanics, and nuclear physics, combined with the history of the making of the atomic bomb, which forms its title. It's a combination of individual biography, of individual science, sort of a group or sort of social biography of the community of theoretical physicists in Western Europe and the United States, and to a lesser degree, Japan.
Yeah, collective biography is a good way of thinking about it. I agree. It's very character-focused, and yet it's like a cast of thousands.
But it works on various scales, but of course combined with the history of the time, because obviously that it's important to understand the making of the atomic bomb, but also it's important it then feeds back and informs the motivations of each individual scientist, many of whom were Jewish, many of whom were...
There's science writing.
And I was going to say, one of the reasons that this book is admired amongst physicists is as science writing, it's superb. Richard Rhodes does not have, as I understand, any science background, but he gets it right in a way many books written by scientists often don't. So
yeah, and also just to push the point about the temporality of it a little bit, it starts off with Rutherford and the discovery of the nature of the atom, which is the 1890s.
That's right. That's right.
It goes back well before Hiroshima, but then it does this amazing thing of accelerating as the kind of crucial years and then months.
Exactly, and then really compressed, and then
it's compressed. Exactly.
expands out in focus.
Much like the atom bomb itself.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
And so I mean, in terms of our conversation, I thought it was a really good view of science as the collective enterprise that I think it actually is. It talks a lot about its nature in the early 20th century, a style which is true in some areas of physics, of these sort of networks of collaborators, of advisee mentor relationships, of sort of centers of training and research, and constant interaction through conferences, through visits to different institutions. And then you see it develop into a much more organized endeavor through the Manhattan Project. And that style of physics, or that style of science, of course, continues in particle physics, and particularly through what's called big science after the war, through because of large experiments which require complex accelerators, large numbers of people building them. It's almost an industrial enterprise.
So it's like, if you build it, they will come. The scientists come to cluster around large pieces of equipment.
Right, and it's a much more. I mean, it's a large number of scientists that do it because it just takes that many scientists to do it. It requires a whole infrastructure of technical staff.
Right.
It's just.
Right, but can I just jump to the chase, Albion? We can go back to the Then you violently shook your head when I said mathematicians and string theorists can go it alone, and I just want to understand, because as a string theorist, you don't need any equipment at all, right?
No.
I mean, all your equipment is up in your head.
So it's only. I think the equipment is only part of course, the driving force. Any laboratory, of course, needs and probably always did need its assistance and so forth.
Right.
And certainly those experiments have gotten more complex, and to launch a major accelerator experiment or an underground lab or a satellite just takes a huge number of people. But many of the people discussed in this book are theorists, and nonetheless, even at that level, you already saw a high degree of interaction between theorists, collaborations between theorists. In string theory, it's relatively rare people to write solo papers. I mean, it's not, relatively, in the tens of percents. I haven't guessed it, but I write very few papers by myself, and I think that's the norm.
One of the things that I think is really compelling about the book, too, is the way it's not just a matter of different expertise or different kinds of labs that have different sorts of infrastructures, but you see people sort of batting ideas back and forth a lot, right? And, getting stuck on something, and somebody else has a little something to nudge. That happens in every, sphere of inquiry, but the way in which it's kind of institutionalized within the sciences seems different.
That's right. I mean, that's you could really see that, and partly you could see it, and that's why in the personal biographical focus was nice, because you could see how it worked at the level of individual ideas.
Maybe just to give our listeners a flavor, because I think everyone should read this book. I was spellbound from the beginning to the end, but I just went through picking out random sentences, and I will just tell you the first two sentences I picked out were like on page 83, then Bohr arrived, and the question they discussed was, and then on page 284, as soon as we entered the office, Bohr rushed to the blackboard telling me, now listen, I have it. And he started scribbling, still without speaking a word, and drawing graphs on the blackboard. He broke several pieces of chalk in the process. So, I mean, I realize Bohr is the hero in both of those, but, there's that image of just, I mean, there's no technology. This is not about Fermi making a reactor. This is just about people rushing into the room and scribbling. And that's what they need to do, is scribble in the presence of someone else.
Right. And that's right. And talk things over. And people also it's a sufficiently complex subject that people coming in with different styles of doing work, different sort of mathematical tool kits are important in any given project and drive things forward.
So not to pick on the perverse end of this side of things, but the Manhattan Project is, it's a bomb-making project.
Yeah.
So we obviously could spend all day talking about the political consequences. I'm not suggesting necessarily we need to think about what hath man wrought, but there's a specific turn where people like Bohr and also this guy whose name I can't say, Zillet, is that his name? Szilard?
Szilard, I think.
Yeah, he's a Hungarian. He's a Hungarian working in America. And Fermi realized that the consequences of what they're now working on is that what they call the Republic of Science, I think that's the Polanyi model of like a pure openness, needs to be turned into a site of secrecy.
Right.
Is that, how do you understand, is that like an anomaly? Like that's just a one-off because they were making an atom bomb? Or is that a long-standing story in science of the 20th and 21st century, that secrecy and openness are always going to be in tension?
This is a super interesting question. So certainly it was there in the Manhattan Project, and part of the tension was, in addition to the ideological component, was, of course, on the one hand, by nature, you probably wanted this to be secret. You didn't want the Germans to know about it.
Right.
Or if you were anti-communist, you didn't want the Soviets to know about it.
Right.
On the other hand, there's a compelling argument for that for these kinds of things to develop, you need as much openness as possible. So there was a lot of argument about, within the sort of envelope of secrecy, how compartmentalized things
Right.
are. And that phrase compartmentalization
Right.
gets used.
And there's the wonderful debate about whether all the people at Los Alamos are going to be conscripted in the army.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
initially they are, but then maybe they're going to push it off a little bit. And
So there's another example comes to mind later. This involvement of basic scientists and military work continued and continues. One example is this group called the Jasons, who are, I don't know their current status. It's actually a bit up in the air currently, but they're a group of mostly physicists originally, who advised them, who would go to meet someplace in the summer, I think down in San Diego, advise the military, work on very specific problems. Out of this came...
Is that why they're called the Jasons? Like July, August, September?
no,
that was...
well,
So there's a good book on this by Anne Finkbeiner, and I think that was one of the theories, but I don't remember if that was the actual reason. But the reasons for this name are discussed. And ideas were developed there that were clearly of use to basic science, such as what's called adaptive optics. It's a way of adjusting a telescope on the ground to deal with atmospheric corrections. Developed in part, I think, by Freeman Dyson in the 60s or 70s, and then eventually redeveloped by astronomers, I think, in the 90s. It's been a while since I've read this book. It was when the astronomers found out that the military had been setting this forever, they were quite furious. They lost out on this opportunity. But I would also say that there are other reasons for secrecy, and this might get into these other team building questions, which is, of course, corporate secrecy. If you have
that's where I was going.
If you have some sort of corporate research, often they'll want to protect those secrets, and that seems to run against the model by which we scientists think we work best, which is completely out on the open.
And also the kind of ethics of, can knowledge be proprietary?
Right. And so then there's the question of what structure supports what. So the gold standard of corporate research in some sense was Bell Labs, where a certain amount of openness did prevail. That had a lot to do with the nature of Bell Labs and the structure of Bell Labs. It was sort of a regulated or controlled monopoly. It didn't have to worry about competitors. And the government had some pressure to bear, could bring some pressure to bear on Bell Labs in terms of how it would be used.
I heartily recommend James Glick's book, The Information, on that.
I should read this.
About Claude Shannon and
John Gardner's book, The Idea Factor, is really superb on it.
As
well. So this was another model, and I think that model, for various reasons, there are still labs like that. I think Microsoft runs a basic research lab of that. That it used to be there were then a number of labs that operated.
Does Google not claim to run a lab like that? I thought they did, but then, or do they just straightforwardly say that what they do is proprietary? And
I should know and don't.
I mean, I want to hear like a Blue Skies division, but it may be that it's Blue Skies, but only within within the prison that is Google or something. Vertical blue sky.
I should know the answer to this, but I don't.
Like nice high walls, blue sky overhead. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, some of their work does get the work that people do does get published. I have a friend who works at Facebook who's been publishing pure science articles. So eventually, this recent announcement of the quote unquote quantum supremacy is supposed to. As the current paper's been
interesting.
That kind of that level of secrecy is normal, and you even see it in this book. Like Bohr wanting to wait to give Meitner and Frisch time to devote to publish a certain work to give them enough credibility so they could get out.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And so clearly, those basic sort of micro level of secrecy, and competition was always there.
And in that double helix, there's that.
Right. But that's less, and that's always a balance, and you don't want to reveal your ideas, especially you don't want to reveal your ideas too early if you think someone's going to run off.
Right. There's this whole tradition of like making announcements in code, right? Like people will put a newspaper ad in, which is a coded claim to priority. So secrecy has been there in the beginning.
Hold on. So if they do that, if someone does that, then it's kind of professional courtesy, not like I'm putting a little flag in this and you shouldn't now publish?
Well, no, it's like the one I remember, I think, is the discovery of Neptune. Anybody know the details about this? But it's like the point was that they didn't want to reveal it yet, but they wanted to be able to go back and say, if you look at the March 20th, 1827 edition of the Times, you're getting it. Yeah, I already said that. It's very interesting. So in other words, like I love the Polanyi model of the openness. I liked how you said it, Albion, that we scientists like to think that we were operating under, but obviously it's always had like gray zones.
And how open you can be depends on your status in the field. It will depend on what fierce competition for scarce resources, fields where there are more people than problems versus more problems than people.
But gray zones is not the same thing as a different kind of an infrastructure.
Yeah,
I think the basic infrastructure is very open, and collaboration and discussion.
Okay, can I just summarize where we are today? Because I want to make sure that we get to the question of the disciplinary difference, which I'm sure Elizabeth and I both have things to say about as being outside. So what I understand you saying, Albion, is that you're actually you're doubling down on the notion of the space of openness and collaboration. Like you're affirming that is kind of woven into the fabric of a lot of what happens when we do science. So now we're going to eventually get to the question of whether the humanities and the social sciences, what happened that we don't have that. And then, but we're going to do it by way of the topic you just opened, Albion, which is like the team building and corporate kind of propagandistic, let's say, accounts of like how this model of collaboration can be revenuized or prioritized. Yeah. So Bell Labs is an interesting example, but I think your point is great. Like they had a monopoly already, which enabled them to not worry so much about like being scooped or yeah. Right. I mean, one of the things that I feel like we experience in the humanities is this kind of I don't think the right word is scientization, but maybe it's like the impetus to be scientistic, that in the humanities people are told your grants will flow more freely if only you could argue like scientists and think like scientists more. And so that's a conditioning pressure now on how the humanities work. And again, as I said, as the child of an English professor and a bench scientist, I love both sides of that form of knowledge. I'm all for it.
Say it.
Well, assuming they listen. Yeah, exactly. But I do worry sometimes that there's a distorting lens there where I want the humanities to figure out ways to be more like science at its best without just faking it in order to basically appeal. I don't want us to put on
the rhetoric.
Yeah, I don't want us to put on the rhetoric of science, which is I definitely think what those Europeans do. I mean, I don't mean to slam the Scandinavian grant-giving institutions, but I do think this whole notion that what you really want is to be part of a $5 million, research team on leisure and the aesthetic. It's just, people create a pseudoscientific framework which doesn't really exist. So that's my kind of wheat and chaff problem with the humanities. I actually think a lot of the things we do best alone. And, we need a team for some things. We don't need a team for other things.
That's reasonable.
So,
yeah.
So maybe this is a moment that I can ask a question with a little bit of I won't even call it ethnography, but so I have a little bit of a vice of reading the announcement articles of the Nobel Prize.
Okay.
This is like a genre that every year comes out. It usually has they didn't believe it. They thought that someone was putting them on.
Right.
And there's some quite, charming romance, right?
Yeah.
But it has a genre. But it also kind of gives you this view, which may or may not be a accurate view of teams, right? It's at least with some of them.
Right.
So, for example, there was the recent one, just to pick up on a couple of them. One of them was the recent one in Madison,
Right.
in which you really seem to get a sense of these, putting together different pieces of the puzzle,
Right.
right? And then the other one, which is not the physical sciences, but the economic sciences, such as we can have a different episode about that. Which is the recent one that was given to the team that's working on the randomized control trials and development economics. And there's this announcement of these three people, but then a kind of at least public recognition that the three people represent a whole number of different organizations,
Sure.
not just scientists, but also NGOs and individual people.
Right.
So those are kind of two different views or images or performances of teams are. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
So certainly there are Nobels given to large teams in the sciences, and it's always an issue. So one was given to the group that found the Higgs. Guarda di Fabio Gennaro was the director of at the time.
And didn't our colleague John Wardle just share, didn't he just get 1/300th of the prize for photographing the black hole?
Did he actually get from that? That could well be. So there can be different models of how you do that. By convention, the Nobel Prize was baked in the, was it late 19th? century.
Maybe early.
This only goes to
late 19th. Yeah.
Actually, I don't know what the original rule is, but now it only goes to 3 people.
Oh, that's right.
It's a structure that is not.
Yeah.
It's a structure that's not obviously well adapted to the way science operates.
I hadn't realized that was part of the.
Yeah.
That's always a restriction, and so I would have people never entirely sure they were joking if they really liked the paper, saying, "I'm only going to allow 2 collaborators on this paper."
That's really funny.
So,
Wow.
at least one case, I'm pretty sure they weren't joking.
But so why did Watson and Crick have to kill Rosalind Franklin then? They could have let her in.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's one model, and I would say also there are clearly prizes for is closer to what you're talking about, not for a lab, but for something that really was a collective effort, where maybe only one person got it for whatever reason. Ken Wilson's Nobel is a good example. Wilson, in his lecture, says this should have also been shared by Leo Kadenoff, by Michael Fisher, who had done really important work leading up to it.
Yep.
This work is often built on other people did it at the same time, et cetera, et cetera. So the prizes are often very problematic in that respect.
Right. And it seems like it maybe is connected to a little bit of what you're saying about the scientization of the humanities, that there's a little bit of a, let's call it fetishizing of the team, right? Like a team has a certain form, and that science has to be produced in a certain way that has this team-like quality.
But to go back to the book, what you see is teams are clearly important, and once you get to the Manhattan Project, it's centrally important.
That's why we talk about Oppenheimer so much, right? Because
to a large degree, he was an amazing leader.
He proved to have this totally unexpected bureaucratic ability.
And that's right. And on the other hand, especially in the early part of the 20th century, there were local teams, but it was much more local teams interacting with each other in various ways, groups, different networks structured around different sort of Rutherford or Bohr, and so forth. Sort of interacting in a much richer way. So it was that kind of openness was clearly important. It wasn't just having a lab where everyone talks to each other, but many labs were with different expertise, with people talking to each other in constant contact.
So how seriously do you take questions of like physical proximity or accidental contact? Like people talk a lot about Building 20 at MIT. Like, do you think that's an important part of it?
Yes, I think. Certainly you see on various levels, I've seen it make a difference in places I've been, when I was a postdoc at Harvard, as we shifted from an old part of Lyman to a rebuilt facility in Jefferson, reached where the particle theorists were moved.
Yeah.
A much more coherent facility, blackboards everywhere, students interlace with faculty, instead of dispersed about the building, made a huge difference in the functioning. And how research was done at Harvard also just made it infinitely more pleasant place to be. And there are like places where it's acknowledged that the space was important. At SLAC and going back to the 60s, people were all packed in together. I have one of my postdoctoral mentors was a founder of a thriving string theory group that existed at Rutgers from the mid-'80s into the mid-'90s. And they said, they designed that space to sort of maximize these kind of interactions that clearly worked. He also said absolutely the most productive time was before that building was built. We were all packed into trailers and couldn't.
Totally, because Building 20 was not designed. It was completely accidental. I mean, like Noam Chomsky only ended up there at like kicking and screaming, I think.
Right.
There was no space for him in a better building.
Right. And so so certainly that matters. And I think also geographic proximity can really matter. The ability to get from one place to the other. It's, I think, one advantage of being, for example, in the Boston area.
Totally.
And even in the New England area, because New York is not hard to get to.
And I think our colleague Adam Jaffe did some work about the persistence of geographical advantage in patents. Like basically one of the best determinants for deciding whether somebody's going to get a patent is how far they live from other people who get patents.
Right.
So it's a dense pack theory. So Silicon Valley continues to have a competitive edge, I'm sure.
Harvard and Berkeley.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right about East Cambridge too. Wait, Albion, I just have to selfishly, can I ask, is there a walking and talking tradition in science?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And there's a mountaineering tradition.
No kidding.
And also sort of a hiking tradition. It's alluded to a bit in this book. There are, has its tragic sides as well. I should say I just lost a couple of good colleagues in mountaineering accidents. But certainly there's a tradition of walking up a mountain and arguing
So I'm trying to bring that back in humanity. That I think is an unalloyed good. So I have peripatetic seminars that I try to organize, but it's an uphill battle.
So Ingham proposed an analogy. So if this model of science is to mountaineering as the Silicon Valley model is to rock climbing.
Oh my God,
does
that's so insidious. Ooh. Because it's like structured corporate play. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, well, rock climbing is a big, I think plays a similar role.
You drive your Tesla to the indoor gym.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right. And yet it's a much more controlled and sort of miniaturized environment.
Depends what you're climbing, I suppose.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I know physicists do that too. So.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, I wanted to propose one sort of like complicator to this model that we're talking about, in which the disciplinary differences are really important, which is that you guys know this book by Jamie Cohen Cole called The Open Mind. And it's about like the structuring myths of universities. And he makes the point that basically in the post-war period, right up through basically to the Berkeley free speech movement. So let's say 45 to 60, when is free speech? 66, 65, that you have this paradigm that the university thrives by being the home of the open mind. And I guess what I was thinking about is that that's actually a formulation that erases the differences between collaboration and solitary thought, because the whole point is that what you're supposed to treasure is spaces of deliberate ignorance or something. Like it's, the open mind is what you're supposed to, check all your beliefs at the door.
Oh, I see. Right. It's like the Clifford here. It's kind of wrong.
I guess so, because I would just feel like, Albion, like what you're saying, when you're talking about people bringing a different toolkit to problem solving, that really prioritizes the notion that people have like different things that they do really well with their brains that they then put in contact with each other. The open mind model is a little different.
I don't know. It's very hard just in absentia to come up with a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
And one way to do this is to talk to other people.
Yeah.
Sort of force you out of your whatever little corner you're in. And that's the value.
Cross difference. Yeah.
That's right. And that's the value of these kinds of exchanges. It's all very nice to say, okay, I'm going to check my conceptions and come up with a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
Personally, and maybe it's a failing of mine, I have no idea how to do that in practice. The most effective way is to talk to people who
maybe
kind of kick me in the rear.
A few humans who can do that, but
right.
the majority don't.
Right. We all have our ways of doing things and the ways we've been brought up to do things. It's a real value.
Heideggerian thrownness and all that. Yeah, I guess it. Yeah. No, that's true. But one formulation that Cohen Cole has that I really like is he says that the university stopped being a model of the nation and became a model for the nation. That is, that it no longer was that the university should look like America. It was like, no, America should look like the university. And his point is that that's like this really fragile consensus that both liberals and conservatives ultimately end up rejecting.
Right.
No, I don't know. So, Elizabeth, can you say more about, like, I set this up as like maybe it's a triangle or maybe it's a number line in terms of where social sciences are in relation to. Can you say more about your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I mean, anthropology is a weird example because anthropology is so sort of built on the mythos of the one researcher in this kind of, intrepid engagement.
Right.
With, people with whom that anthropologist is deeply unfamiliar or something like that. Right. I'm not defending that model necessarily, but that's it's so sort of baked into the discipline that it's hard to.
Right. Though nowadays those folks are so connected,
right, exactly,
field.
Yeah. And nowadays I think partly because of the European funding model, and other things happening in the U.S., there's much more emphasis on kind of team sorts of projects, although it often ends up being one person who kind of gets kind of crowned as the main person in that, right? So there's still a sort of individualizing at the top, I think. I would be. But I think, the question of like whether it's team or individual, I think is a version of the dilemma that anthropology is kind of always in, which is, are we a science or are we a humanities, right? And which, that I mean, the example that I was going to give for recallable books, I can jump ahead for a second.
Yeah, sure. Do your recallable book. Yeah.
It sort of speaks to what you're saying is this very famous team-based project, but not exactly in the same way as you're describing, Albion. which is called The People of Puerto Rico, which is a project. I think it was published in 1956, and it was it was directed by Julian Stewart, and it had at Columbia, and it was 5 of his doctoral students, and each of them took a different place in Puerto Rico, a different one was a coffee plantation, one was sugarcane workers. There's an urban one. In fact, Robert Manners, who was a professor for a long time in the department here at Brandeis, was one of them. And the idea was that this was a way for anthropology to start talking about, to move beyond the so-called village, to start talking about how a nation is composed, right? So it was very pointedly called not the peoples of Puerto Rico, but the people of Puerto Rico.
And was one of them New Yorican? Like, was somebody embedded in New York?
No.
Nowadays, I think that would happen.
Would be.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's been some very interesting kind of discussions of what that would look like.
Yeah.
But, that was sort of like taking the anthropological solitary model.
Yeah.
It was kind of a modular structure.
Yeah.
And fitting it in within this team, but not, I'm sure there was a lot of batting back and forth of ideas. There must have been. So, but and the authors talk about that, but that wasn't the way it was structured.
Yeah. I think this might be a great time to move to Recallable Book. So, Elizabeth, do you want to add a Recallable Book, or was that that's an excellent one?
I think that was mine.
Cool. And Albion, do you want to tell us about yours? So this is the portion of the show where we think about, if you like the sorts of things we're talking about today, where else would you want to go?
So I'll do one out of left field, just for fun, which is
mine is out of left field too.
The book.
Left field's getting crowded.
Yeah.
Book, A Message to Our Folks. The woman's name is Steinbeck. It's a history of the art ensemble of Chicago.
Wow.
And this sort of experimental music group that came out of the south side of Chicago in the 50s and 60s. And
oh, wow. Yeah, we haven't talked about creative ensembles at all.
And so this is one, and this is, I think, partly in the nature of jazz of the time. You get a sense of people are involved in different sort of overlapping groups.
Yeah.
It's a similar model of, sort of groups coming together for a project, sometimes for very long periods of time, people being in several groups, obviously trading ideas off of each other. It also pays a lot of attention to the context that could generate a scene like that.
Totally.
That'd be like, what was going on in Southside Chicago during and after World War II that allowed this kind of thing to flower? How do people get the education they get? How could they find venues to play and to interact with each other? Why do you not see this now, et cetera?
That's great.
It's all. I think that's a very interesting thing to think about in this, if you're thinking about sort of models of creative interaction.
Yeah, that's another good version of like why group biographies are necessary, and especially since it's Chicago, home of the Chicago School. That's so perfect.
Right.
That makes me wish that I had chosen Lunar Men by Jenny Uglow, but I'll name check it anyway because that's a great book about Birmingham in the 1810s. So mine is even further out of left field. Mine's out of the bleachers. It's George Eliot's Middlemarch. Perhaps you've heard of it. And the reason being that
your copy is sitting on my bookshelf now.
Oh, really?
You're just waiting to.
Oh, yeah, of course, right. We talked about it. Yeah. So there's a scientist at the center who I think my dad has always identified with, named Lydgate, and then there's also this dry as dust, scholastic, I guess, humanist, basically named Casaubon, who is like the least human character, and he's just caught up in his own mind, writing a terrible book called Key to All Mythologies. Thank you so much. And he's basically just constantly involved in trench warfare with other people. And so he epitomizes humanities as just like arid isolation. Yeah. But then Lydgate is incredibly poignant because he actually is committed to being part of this scientific world, but he's asking his questions spoiler alert, he's asking his questions slightly in the wrong way. And because he's no longer part of the scientific community that he was in when he was studying at Paris, where everything is going on, instead, he's in a provincial town.
Doesn't he hit up against Bulstrode and?
Yeah, he gets caught in life. I mean, he gets caught up in having a social life.
There's a parallel there to the questions about donors. And
he gets absolutely. He gets implicated and tied in to the web of influence that for other people is so emancipatory, for him ultimately becomes super restrictive. So I just find it a very poignant book because it's both about what scientific collaboration might be and also about what it means that, as it so often is, that when it isn't.
That's a great example.
Well, Albion, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. I virtually shake your hand over the air.
Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. So I should say that Recall This Book is hosted by John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. Sound editing is by Claire Ogden. Website design and social media is done by Matthew Schratz. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Please email us directly or contact us via social media and our website. And finally, I'm going to say this, but I will keep on saying it. If you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to write a review or rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And also just forward it to your friends or other people you think might be interested. And you may be interested, if you enjoyed this, in checking out past episodes, including topics like new and old media, opiate addiction, post-industrial America, and recent interviews with Xishan Liu, Zadie Smith, Samuel Delaney, and the English filmmaker Mike Lee. So from all of us here at Recall This Book,
And that
thanks
was the
for
public
listening.
announcement.
And that was a public announcement. It's coming!